So what are APIs? APIs are application programming interfaces, and they're used in what is called service-oriented architecture. And basically all this is where you need to use a service or resource that a vendor owns. So let's say you want to be able to have your application send out SMS messages, right? You don't want to build your own server in order to do that. You don't want to own all of the resources and responsibility. You just want to use a company like Twilio. So what the API is basically it's a way for your code to be able to interact with their systems to be able to use whatever resources they offer. So basically with an API call, it's called an API call, you would give your security credentials. So there might be a username, there might be a password, there might be a secret key. A lot of times they're what are called API keys. And so basically within your code, you add the API key. If you're sending out an SMS message, you would probably have like the to phone number, you would have the from phone number, and then you would have the message, right? So basically that would be sent to the API for Twilio. Twilio would take the API key or the security credentials, verify what rights you have on their systems. Then if you have the right to use their system, they would then basically format an SMS message with the to, from, and message, and then send that out to whoever is going to be accessing it. Basically, that's how the APIs work. Again, if you're going to be sending out emails, there's API for a company called SendGrid, that allows you to send emails basically from your code. So with Python, you can send out an email going through SendGrid. There are other APIs. So let's say you want to use artificial intelligence, right? OpenAI, the creators of ChatGPT, there's actually an OpenAI API. So you can create your code, right? So you can create a little AI application. Basically, you ask the user for whatever it is that they want, hit the submit button, and then instead of your server basically running that AI process, you send that query up to OpenAI servers through the API call. They send back a response, and then you show that response up on the screen or do with it as you see fit. So that's basically all we're talking about with APIs. These are resources that you're going to need in your applications that basically vendors are offering you. So some of them are free, some of them are paid. Basically, you use an API call in order to connect to their systems. You send them the request, they send back the response, and that's how the API process works. Now, one of the big things to think about when you're using API calls is to understand the resource consumption that is used to provide the response that you're looking for. That all gets processed on the vendor's systems. So let's say you want to create an IoT AI device, right? So this is a Raspberry Pi 4. It's powerful for what it is, but it's a pretty low power computer. But you want to create a system where this is going to use artificial intelligence. If you actually try to run an AI framework on this poor little board, surprisingly, it will work. To be clear, it will work, but it'll take a while, right? It'll take like 2 minutes. We talk about speed and latency when we're creating applications. If you make the request on the board itself, right? Basically, you have AI on here, it'll take about 2 minutes for it to figure out what the response will be and give a response back, which is probably not what you're looking for. So one of the cool things with the API calls is you can have a low power system like this. Basically, somebody interacts with a system. Maybe they type something in, maybe it listens, maybe it's listening for a command, maybe it has computer vision on here. It can actually do that. Basically, the input comes in here. So this has enough power for the input. It then takes that input, sends that input with whatever the request and everything else is, up to something like OpenAI's API. So it says, here's information, here's what I want to know about the information, and it sends that to OpenAI's infrastructure, right? Basically, OpenAI, it will then process everything. They have their NVIDIA H100 chips and all that kind of stuff. It will do the artificial intelligence there, and then it will send the response back. So what's really cool is you can have an incredibly low power computer system that is able to give the functionality of something that would be much larger and much more expensive because you're using that API vendor's resources. Everything is getting processed on their system. All you have to do is you simply have to collect the information, send the information, and then show whatever the response is. So that's a big thing with using APIs. Now, the final thing I'll say here with using an API is basically distrust, verify, stay suspicious, right? This is one of the favorite things I like to say. Distrust, verify, stay suspicious. Don't trust anybody ever for anything. Basically, especially in the technology world. Something that you have to think about with these APIs and these API vendors is you are sending your data to them. I don't care what they say on their website. I don't care what they say in their terms of service. It's important to understand you're taking your data and you are sending it to them, and you really have no idea what they're doing with your data, right? So they can process your data, you get the response back, that's fine, so your little program works, but you don't know if they're saving your data into their own database system. You don't know if they're actually analyzing the data that you're submitting to them to try to figure out some other type of information. So let's imagine you have some kind of real estate website, right? So you have a real estate website where people can plug in addresses and ask little questions, right? To figure out where they want to buy a house. Well, think about this. If you're using some kind of API to provide a response for you, if you send, right, the address, and if you send some other information for that API vendor to do the processing, they can be collecting all of that information on their back end, basically to see what areas of the country people are looking to move to, right? And that is something that could be valuable to a different company. Might actually be valuable literally to your own competitor, right? Or other things to be thinking about. If you send out information that might have personally identifiable information, right? So basically, let's say you're doing artificial intelligence, and so you might send out somebody's username or maybe somebody's social security number or something like that. Maybe you're trying to figure out some kind of statistical relevance. Well, if you send out the name and you send out the social security number and you send out the phone number, some of this other stuff, right? That can all be collected within the vendor's, API infrastructure, and you don't know how that will be used, so be very careful. What I would argue is whenever you use an API, send as little data as possible. Don't send them everything. Literally figure out what information you need to send to the API, and then only send that specific information to the API. The other thing that you might think about, again, if you're concerned about competitors, is to use different vendors for basically the API services. One of the great things with APIs, again, with service-oriented architecture, is you can swap vendors, right? You can have just different code for different vendors. One of the things you might think about doing is find 3 or 4 competitors and then basically just have a randomization algorithm. So when you go to process something, it will just randomly select one vendor or another to process for you to get the response back. And then they're not necessarily able to collect, the specific information, right? They can't actually see, you can't track how you're asking questions because it's getting randomized to different places. That's something to think about. And then the final thing to consider with the APIs is the concept of encryption in transit. So remember, when you're doing an API call, right, you're taking information from your computer, from your device, you're sending that to the API vendor and getting a response back. One of the things you have to think about with your infrastructure is, can there be a man-in-the-middle attack? Can somebody somehow get a system in between yours and the vendor and basically collect the information that you're sending up there? That's one of the things you have to think about with architecture and, again, with security and that type of deal. But anyways, basically that's all the APIs are. All the APIs are is where you're using a vendor's resources. Basically, you make an API call. Generally, you're going to use the API key. You're going to go through a whole process with the API keys. You're going to get the API key for the API vendor. You're then going to make your request. You're then going to send that to them, and then you're going to get a response back.